Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Big shout out to Netscape Navigator. Those were fun times. We didn't have CSS yet, and I didn't actually recreate my website from back then. But if you imagine just a wall of Doom tiles from the video game, overlaid in with like lime green text, and this is my first website on a IBM 386. Dating myself a little bit, but it's just a passion that I've had since I was a little child for both video games, but also building software, building websites. So the theme of this talk is staff engineers more than special armor. And kind of the story of where this came from was I was interviewing with Peloton, and I was coming from a staff engineer role at a previous company and looking at this new role as a senior staff engineer. And I interviewed my SVP. And I wanted to ask him, like, what do you expect out of this role? Like, what do you see the purpose of a staff engineer? What does it look like in the e-commerce org at Peloton? What would you want out of me? And we kind of settled on this idea that like a staff engineer is more than just a senior engineer who wears special armor. And I think that this is kind of the default that we see among staff engineers, right? Like, especially as you grow in your career from senior engineer, well, junior, mid, senior, into staff engineer, your first role that you're going to have as a staff engineer is going to be a super-powered senior engineer. Next slide, please. And so there's this idea of progression to greatest technical skill being 80% of becoming a staff engineer. The joke is that 20% of becoming a staff engineer is talking about being a staff engineer. Which I swear to God, that's like most of my one-on-ones is just figuring out what does a staff engineer do. And we see like growing from like little baby toad engineer all the way up to like having this crazy ruby studded wonderful armor, which is great and all, but that's 80%. The other 20% is kind of what pushes us over the line. And the other 20% is where these things get really murky of like, all right, so I'm a staff engineer. What am I doing that's different than just being a senior engineer? Am I expanding my scope of impact past just the team level? And as a senior staff engineer, maybe as a principal engineer, am I expanding my scope of impact towards multiple teams or disparate parts of the organization? Maybe the connection between e-commerce at Peloton and maybe connected fitness, our bikes, treadmills, content, and so forth. That 20% is filling in the gaps. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, filling in the gaps between teams and functional roles and working effectively involves knowing our strengths and playing to them. So as a staff engineer, like far and beyond having a good technical competence is very important. But there are new factors that come into play where my value is not just in pull requests, and it's not just in reviews of pull requests or any of this kind of stuff that I can come up with, but it's also how am I interacting with other stakeholders, whether those people are in management, whether they are on the business side, whether it's customers, whether it's ideas for how should our UX work as somebody who has a passion for UX, but is trained as an engineer. Somebody who can understand sort of like the complicated picture of how maybe a lot of legacy systems work relative to what are we trying to deliver as a customer experience. I think it's a very common refrain in engineering of like, oh, this would be so much better if maybe product didn't have these ideas, or if maybe design didn't decide to make it interesting, and not everything needs to be interesting. As a staff engineer, it's part of my role to be able to have those conversations on their own level with the designers as well, or with product as well, or management, business stakeholders, whoever, to be able to come to some place of harmony. So Bridgewater Principles, anybody who's read the book knows that like it pretty much all revolves around little simple heuristics that you can have for thinking about things that say 80% of the time are going to be effective, 20% of the time there's going to be maybe some differences of opinion or whatever. So the rest of this presentation, totally unscientific. These are some ideas kind of spitballing of different archetypes that you might see within staff engineers. And the goal of this is just to think of staff engineers as more than just these monolithic developers that are super powered senior engineers. Because at this level, you wind up having crazy depth in some areas, and maybe some shallowness in other areas. And then maybe you have some crazy depth in some completely unexpected areas that make you into this, this person that's not just another fungible part of your engineering ecosystem. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here's our 80%. This is the team lead staff engineer. They got the crazy special armor. This is often the person that's going to be promoted internally. They're going to have that deep domain expertise. They know where all the bodies are buried in your systems. They have seen all of the failures. They've seen everything that can go wrong, and they've seen all the duct tape. They're going to have that deep company expertise. They're going to have a lot of understanding of the domain that they're working in. For instance, Peloton subscriptions is the area that I've been most involved with lately. We have a staff engineer who's like, oh my God, this guy knows our subscriptions product in and out. Like, this guy is amazing. And where do I fit in with that? That's a question for a different time. But they're going to be broadly connected internally. They're going to know the other people within the business that they need to talk to. So if we're talking about subscriptions, maybe they're going to be able to tell me who to talk to from accounting, finance, reporting. Next slide, please. So we go to other types of staff plus engineers. By the way, I forgot to mention, all of the art here comes from ChatGPT, which is great. And I wanted to have this, this journey from, like, I don't know, space combat game into Stardew Valley without breaking anybody's copyrights, which is mostly, it mostly works, except for Stardew Valley doesn't sit there. So I've had to manually edit Stardew Valley's logo out of many of my slides. But yeah, so we've got other types of staff engineers. There's the two of these I would identify with, one of them I would resoundingly not. So we've got the outsider, we've got the diplomat, and we have your standard kind of like genius senior or staff engineer or whatever. Next slide, please. So the outsider, this is definitely one of the roles that I fall into. I've worked sort of like from my introduction, I've worked at huge companies like American Express. I've worked at little startups like the one out of Bridgewater. I've worked at you know, scale ups like my previous one. I've worked at turnarounds, and I consider Peloton in the kind of turnaround category. And because of that, I've seen many architectures from like your very entry level, like your beginning stuff, your first few lines of code, onto something that has been around since like 1997, American Express, and really everything in between. And I've seen a lot of those pain points, and I've seen a lot of the areas where others have gone wrong. So there's a certain experience of dealing with the consequences of your code, and I've seen that in various places. Likewise, I've seen many different cultures in teams. As a staff engineer, this becomes really helpful, especially when a large part of your role is to disseminate culture, right? So like my job a lot of times is to be like, hey, I've seen this thing at another company and it worked really well. I think that we should do this thing here. Or I've seen this thing that we do maybe in our team culture or meeting culture, and maybe that's not working as well as it could be. And I saw it work better in this other place, or we're doing it really well over here, like keep it up. And great source of dumb questions, right? So like I come into a job, I'm new to a company, but I have some experience and I've seen some things at some other places. And I can ask these questions that maybe somebody who's been around for long enough to get kind of cooked is not thinking about anymore. And it becomes almost like the 4-minute mile, where nobody thought breaking a 4-minute mile was possible until somebody broke the 4-minute mile. And after that, all sorts of people broke the 4-minute mile. It took that example of something being possible before anyone did it. Next slide, please. So our next one, this is the other one that I really identify with, the diplomat. Non-engineering job experience. So in my case, and like I said, this is totally unscientific. It's more a reflection of my own background. If it gives you imposter syndrome or anything like that, everything that I'm not gives me imposter syndrome. And we'll talk about that on another slide. But my non-engineering job experience, right? So we talk about Netscape, and then we talk about some stuff at like American Express. In between was the movie Office Space, which totally turned me off to the idea of ever being a software engineer. I forgot about being a software engineer. I went into other things that were tech related, including working for Verizon Wireless for a couple of years as a frontline sales representative. And it's the kind of thing where having that experience of hands-on the software that's being built internally and used internally can give a new perspective that maybe if my whole career I had spent working in software engineering, I might not have that same visceral response. And for those from Peloton who are here tonight, you know how I feel about like internal tooling, how it should actually be kind of great. And that's sometimes a controversial opinion. But I've had the experience of having to like actually use it. Great customer service is a part of it. I would say one of the most fun roles that I've ever had was building an auction house. And it was we sold it to eBay eventually. But the difference was instead of singular auctions, it was like many items in one auction. And it all ran at the same time. There was a staff that cataloged everything, and that there was a finance crew, there was shipping, warehousing. All of those people were able to speak to me, and they were able to request features. And I was able, as a direct person, as a staff engineer, to say, hey, that idea that you think is really complicated, that's actually something that we could really do. Or that thing that sounds like really, really simple is actually way more complicated than you expect. And as a staff engineer, whether it's working with the external stakeholders or it's working with contributors from other teams, it's really important to have that spirit of customer service towards the people that you work with. It's part of leadership. It's part of spreading good culture. And this is part of hinging between functional roles, is looking outward at everybody as a customer. So let's say maybe with Peloton, the Peloton members are our customers. But sometimes there's an intermediary between me and the customer. And so sometimes my customer is going to be a customer support representative, right? Sometimes my customer is going to be somebody in accounting. And do I treat them as a distraction that is taking away from some feature that I want to build to delight the members? Or am I treating that person as my customer? And that helps me to be a better hinge between functional roles when they see and I live that attitude. Our next slide, please. And so this brings us to the next archetype that I definitely don't identify with, but this is kind of like your classic staff plus engineer. This person that wrote the coolest open source software in whatever your field, and they are just well, I call them genius, right? Or this is the person that'll go in and they will firefight any bug that's hidden out inside of your code base, and they will get it done. This is the person that's going to be out there, creating all sorts of new IP and getting patents and all that kind of stuff. All things that I would wish to do, but not necessarily what I would call my forte. And I like to highlight that because of my own imposter syndrome, and I know that others have imposter syndrome, that we don't need to be all of these things all of the time. It's more a matter of striving towards that perfection, but accepting where we are and playing to our strengths. Next slide, please. And so this is a slide on imposter syndrome and frustration. And the Einstein quote, I'm sure many people have heard, everyone's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll live its whole life believing that it is stupid. With a staff engineer, you want to put them in the right space. As somebody who is pretty proudly like front-end oriented, if you were to pluck me up and put me into a project that is entirely event-driven microservices and all I'm doing is Kotlin, maybe I'm not going to be as productive, or maybe I'm not going to be as inspired as I would be if I was working in something that had more of a bearing on UI and UX and stuff like that. And you put me in an area like that, and then I can start thinking about like, oh, here's some really great reusable abstractions that we can bring across the company so people that don't give a crap about UI and UX can deliver something that's good easily without having to think about it too much. Next slide, please. And so the question becomes assigning staff plus engineers. We have our team leads, the really classic role for staff engineers. But we can also think about like cross-team collaboration. A lot of my work has to do with how multiple teams work together. And then there's also the idea of off the roadmap, right? So like I am a singular resource. I am one person that can fall off of the balance sheet and nobody's going to notice, right? Product's not going to complain. Other managers aren't going to complain. Nobody's going to be like, why are we assigning all of these people to work on this thing? I'm one person that can run in there and perhaps do a thing and get to a certain level of depth where we don't need to assign a whole lot of resources to move a project over the line. Next slide, please. And this is kind of our last slide is, the right game, right time, the right players, bring in the staffs when your needs get ambiguous. Staff engineer can be a vanity title if your company's not ready for it yet, right? Like there are some companies that only need, say, software engineer. They only need manager or senior engineer. But once you're at a certain level of maturity where you really need to be able to, where you have gaps that need to be filled between teams, that's the time to start thinking about having staff engineers and bring them in when the needs get ambiguous. If you can merely put front-end engineer or DevOps engineer, back-end on something and they're at the senior level, the better use of resources is probably to use that person. But where you need puzzle pieces to fit together, and this is the only slide where I'll really explain things. Chess pieces, when your stuff is really simple, you know exactly who everybody is. But puzzle pieces on the other side, once things get ambiguous, and ChatGPT might have made those puzzle pieces kind of messed up, honestly, but like similar size, the reality is that we all have different connections, and that puzzle, when we put it together, gets really beautiful. And it can drive organizational impact. And we'll hear from the rest of these speakers too about how to do that effectively. So I'll just leave you with the last slide, please, which is just a goodbye. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very insightful speech and lots of personal experience shared here. And my main takeaways is whatever took you here, and it's your technical skill, it's not going to take you there. So as soon as you approach in this role, it's time to learn some of those soft skills. And there is some room for frustration. There is some room for imposter syndrome. And when that imposter syndrome hits, the most important thing to remember is your strengths. Leaning into your technical strength, remembering who you are, but then slowly learning those soft skills. So again, thank you for this. And I want to, at this point, move to the next